That's a museum piece, old-timer. You gonna hit anything with it? Or just make a lot of noise?" The voice was slick with the easy arrogance of youth, cutting through the crisp autumn air. The old man, Arthur, didn't turn. He simply ran a thumb, the skin worn smooth as river stone, over the scarred wooden stalk of the Mosin Nagant. His gaze remained fixed down the 1,000-yard range, his pale blue eyes possessing a clarity that defied the network of wrinkles surrounding them. The distant steel target shimmered, a tiny silver postage stamp against the brown earth of the berm. "Just one shot," he said, his voice a low gravel, not meant for the boy but for the rifle itself. The challenge was set, the mockery hanging thick and oily in the air, but nobody there knew who they were talking to. If you believe respect is earned through a lifetime of quiet, dignity, type honor in the comments below. Arthur Pendleton's mornings were a ritual of quiet defiance against the stiffness in his joints. He rose before the sun, not because he had to, but because his body's clock was still set to a dawn that had broken over a frozen, foreign landscape 70 years ago. He moved through his small, meticulously tidy house with a deliberate economy of motion, each step placed with the certainty of a man who knows the geography of his world intimately. The floorboards didn't creak for him. In the kitchen, he spooned coarse black coffee grounds into a percolator, the metallic scrape and clink the only sounds in the pre-dawn stillness. While it brewed, he would stand at the window overlooking his small garden, his hands resting on the sill. It was his left hand that betrayed him, a slight persistent tremor, almost imperceptible unless you were looking for it. It wasn't the shaking of old age, it was different. It was a vibration, a memory of cold so profound it had settled deep in his nerves and never truly left. He'd often close his fingers into a loose fist, not to stop the tremor, but to feel it, to acknowledge the ghost that lived within him. He carried his reading glasses in a soft leather pouch, worn dark with the oil of his hands over decades. The stitching was frayed at the corners, and a single dark stain marred the flap, a mark he never spoke of. It was just a part of him, like the small, almost invisible scar shaped like a perfect five-pointed star just below his left ear, hidden by the collar of his shirt. It was the only medal he ever wore. 300 miles away, in a city of marble and monuments, a man in a crisply pressed uniform was about to pick up his phone. He would listen for exactly 4 seconds, his entire posture changing, and then he would grab his keys and walk out of his office without telling his aide a single word of where he was going. The Red Stag shooting complex was a cathedral of modern ballistics. It smelled of burnt powder, hot metal, and the faint, clean scent of Hopp's No. 9 gun oil. The air was split by the supersonic crack of high-velocity rounds fired from rifles that looked more like science fiction props than firearms. Carbon fiber stocks, massive telescopic sights, and computerized wind gauges were the tools of the trade. Here, precision was a commodity you could buy. Arthur stood at the end of the long-range line, a gray ghost in a world of digital camouflage and tactical gear. Beside him, his grandson, Leo, a boy of 16 with his grandfather's quiet eyes, but none of his stillness, shifted nervously. It was Leo's idea to bring the Mosin. It had been his great-grandfather's, then Arthur's, and now it was destined for him. It was a piece of family history, long and heavy, its wooden stock smelling of aged linseed oil and something else, something metallic and cold, like winter. 2 lanes over, Kyle and his friend Chad were setting up. Their equipment spilled out of hard pelican cases like a surgeon's instruments. Kyle's rifle was a sleek black machine of machined aluminum and polymer, topped with an optic the size of a small telescope. He adjusted his bipod with a series of loud, satisfying clicks, each one a declaration of his seriousness. He watched Arthur and Leo unsheath the old Mosin from its canvas sleeve and let out a short, derisive laugh that he made sure was loud enough to carry. "Look at that, Chad. Somebody raided Grandpa's closet." Chad snickered, fiddling with his own high-tech setup. The air was charged, not with the energy of a friendly competition, but with the grating friction of two different worlds colliding. But what none of them knew, not Kyle, not Chad, not even Frank, the range owner watching from his office, was that in exactly 47 minutes, a nondescript black SUV would turn off the main highway and pull into that parking lot, and it would change every single thing about this moment. The first volley of disrespect was casual, thrown like a stone into a still pond. "Careful with that thing, Pops," Kyle called over, his voice oozing condescension. "The Smithsonian might want it back in one piece." Arthur didn't acknowledge him. He was showing Leo how to properly seat the rifle against his shoulder, how to find the natural point of aim. His hands moved over the weapon with a slow, reverent familiarity. He spoke to his grandson in a low, calm voice, his words swallowed by the next sharp crack from Chad's rifle. "Breathing is everything, Leo," Arthur murmured, his hand gently on the boy's back. "You don't hold your breath. You let it out slow, and you fire in the pause, right between heartbeats. The world gets quiet in that pause." Kyle, annoyed at being ignored, grew louder. "Hey, I'm talking to you, old man. You even know how to use the safety on that relic?" Arthur finally turned his head. He didn't look at Kyle. He looked at the rifle in Kyle's hands, his eyes tracing its modern, aggressive lines. Then he looked back at his own Mosin, at the simple, rugged bolt and the honest steel. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of private understanding with the inanimate object. He said nothing. His silence was a wall, and Kyle, used to being the center of attention, began to push against it. His ego pricked. The quiet dignity of the old man was an indictment of his own noisy arrogance, and he couldn't stand it. He saw weakness where there was only patience, and he prepared to press his advantage, oblivious to the fact that he was picking a fight with a monument. The mockery began to draw an audience. A few other shooters on the line paused their own meticulous preparations to watch the unfolding drama. It was a familiar scene at any gun range. The gear-obsessed youth versus the old-timer with his classic firearm. Most assumed they knew how it would end, with the old man fumbling, his pride bruised, retreating to the quiet comfort of his memories. Kyle fed off the attention. "You actually think you can see the target from here with those?" he asked, pointing a thumb at the Mosin's simple iron sights, a notched rear leaf and a hooded front post. "My scope has an app. I can calculate windage and drop on my phone. What have you got? Hope?" His friend Chad laughed dutifully. "He's got the force, Kyle." Leo's face was burning with a mixture of shame and anger. He wanted to say something, to defend his grandfather, but he was intimidated by their confidence, their expensive equipment, their sheer volume. He looked at Arthur, pleading with his eyes for them to just pack up and leave. But Arthur remained placid, his expression unreadable. Frank, the range owner, a burly man with a permanent look of weary cynicism, stepped out of his office. "All right, fellas, keep the chatter down. People are trying to concentrate." His tone was mild, a perfunctory request for order rather than a genuine intervention. He saw two peacocks puffing their chests, and an old man who was probably in over his head. Just another Tuesday. It was then that Kyle saw his opening to seal his dominance. He pulled a crisp $50 bill from his wallet and slapped it on the shooting bench. I bet you $50 you can't even hit the paper at 1,000 yards. Hell, I'll be surprised if you hit the berm. The officer thought this was the end of the conversation. He was wrong. This was the beginning of the worst day of his career. For the first time, Arthur looked directly at Kyle. His eyes were not angry. They were not offended. They were appraising, like a carpenter looking at a piece of wood, noting its grain, its knots, its potential. He saw the insecurity churning beneath the boy's bravado. He saw the desperate need for validation. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of young replacements, terrified and trying to hide it with swagger right before they were sent up the line. He turned his gaze to his grandson. He saw the humiliation in Leo's posture, the way his shoulders slumped. He saw the boy's faith in him wavering, being eroded by the acid of public ridicule. And in that moment the decision was made. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about pride. It was for the boy. It was a lesson that needed to be taught, not with words, but with action. Arthur closed his eyes for a long moment. The cacophony of the range faded away. In its place he felt the ghost of a biting wind on his cheeks. He could smell pine needles and the faint, metallic tang of blood on snow. He felt the familiar weight of a different rifle, its stock numbingly cold against his face. The tremor in his left hand steadied, just as it always did when the world narrowed to a single point. He was no longer an old man at a civilian shooting range. He was back in the pause, the quiet space between heartbeats where everything was clear. He opened his eyes. The distant target seemed to pull closer, the world around it losing focus. He gave a slow nod to Kyle, a silent acceptance of the challenge. "The boy will take your money," Arthur said, his voice calm and even. "After the shot." Arthur's preparation was a silent, deliberate ritual that hushed the firing line. He ignored the bench rest everyone else used. Instead, he sat on the ground, crossing his legs in a way that looked both ancient and perfectly stable. He took the simple canvas sling of the Mosin and with a few fluid motions wrapped it around his left arm, pulling it tight against his bicep. It was a hasty sling, a technique of a bygone era, creating a solid, triangulated support between his body and the rifle. He became a human tripod, a living, firing platform. The few knowledgeable shooters on the line recognized the technique and exchanged curious glances. This was not the fumbling of a novice. This was old-school mastery. As he settled the rifle butt into the pocket of his shoulder, he murmured something under his breath, the words too quiet for anyone to hear clearly, but the cadence was strange, foreign. "Vesi on marca, terras on cova," he whispered. "Water is wet, steel is hard." It was a Finnish mantra, a focus phrase taught to him by a ghost in a white parka a lifetime ago. A few lanes down, a man named David, a mild-mannered accountant and military history aficionado, had been watching with growing fascination. He recognized the sling technique from old training manuals. He saw the absolute focus in the old man's eyes. Something felt different here. This wasn't just an old man with an old gun. He discreetly raised his phone and started recording, zooming in on the strange, profound stillness of the shooter. And as he sat there in that plastic chair waiting for someone to call his name, not a single person in that room knew that the tremor in his hands wasn't from age. It was from the same thing that had earned him the metal locked inside the glove box of his truck. David the accountant felt a jolt of recognition, a spark in the deep archives of his memory. It wasn't just the sling technique. It was the man's profile, the set of his jaw, the high cheekbones, the unnerving calm. He had seen that face before, not in person, but in a grainy black and white photograph in a book about the Korean War, a book about a small, almost mythical unit of sniper observers who operated deep behind enemy lines during the brutal winter of 1950. He quickly stopped recording and zoomed in on the video he'd just taken, capturing a clear image of the old man's face. His fingers trembled slightly as he sent the short clip to a friend, a retired Army Sergeant Major named Ken. The text message was simple. "Ken, you're not going to believe this. Red Stag Range." Look at this guy. Ring any bells from The Frozen Chosen? History? Miles away, Ken's phone buzzed. He was in his workshop, polishing a set of medals for an upcoming ceremony. He glanced at the screen, annoyed at the interruption. Then he saw the video. He watched the old man wrap the sling. He saw his face. Ken dropped the medal he was holding. It clattered to the floor, unheard. His blood ran cold. He didn't just recognize the face from a book. He had heard the stories his entire career, passed down in hushed, reverent tones. The legend of the winter ghost. He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking more than the old man's. He scrolled through his contacts, past generals and colonels, to a single private number listed only as Thorne. He pressed call. The phone was answered on the first ring. "Sir," Ken stammered, his voice tight. "Sir, you need to get to the Red Stag shooting complex. Now, it's him. I swear to God, sir, it's him." While a phone call that would alter the day was being made, Kyle and Chad were reveling in their perceived victory. They had their own phones out, recording what they were sure would be a viral video of an old man making a fool of himself. "Here we go, YouTube gold," Chad whispered to Kyle, snickering. Hashtag Grandpa Goes Boom. Kyle grinned, framing the shot to include the impossibly distant target. The crowd was silent, waiting. Arthur took a slow, deep breath, held it, and then began to exhale. The front sight post of the Mosin settled on the center of the steel plate. The world narrowed to that single point of focus. The notched rear sight, the hooded front sight, the shimmering target, 3 points in perfect, stark alignment. In the quiet space between one heartbeat and the next, he squeezed the trigger. The Mosin Nagant roared. It was not the sharp, sterile crack of the modern rifles. It was a deep, resonant boom, a thunderclap from another century that shook the concrete floor and echoed off the high corrugated roof of the firing line. The rifle bucked hard against Arthur's shoulder, a familiar, violent kiss. He absorbed the recoil effortlessly, his body a well-practiced shock absorber. The heavy 7.62 by 54 millimeter R round tore through the air, a tiny, invisible messenger of physics and will. An eternity seemed to pass in the 2 seconds it took for the bullet to travel 1,000 yards. Then a sound returned, faint but unmistakable, a clear, high-pitched ping. Silence descended upon the Red Stag shooting complex, complete and total silence broken only by the gentle whisper of the wind. Everyone stared downrange, then at Arthur, then at the smoking cartridge ejecting from the Mosin, as Arthur worked the bolt with practiced smoothness. Kyle's jaw was slack. His phone drooped in his hand. "No way," he breathed. "That was a fluke. A lucky shot. Wind shear, barometric pressure. It's impossible. Do it again." What the young officer didn't realize was that someone was already watching. Someone who recognized that face from a photograph that had hung on a wall in the Pentagon for 29 years. A black Lincoln Navigator with tinted windows and two discreet government plates pulled into the gravel parking lot of the shooting range. It moved with a purpose that made the pickup trucks and SUVs around it look frivolous. It parked not in a designated spot, but directly in front of the main entrance, angled as if ready for a swift departure. The driver's side door opened, and a man in his late 60s emerged. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, but he wore it like a uniform. His posture was ramrod straight, his movements precise, his short gray hair cut with military severity. This was General Marcus Thorne, retired, though a man like Thorne was never truly retired. He walked into the range office, his polished shoes making no sound on the dusty concrete floor. Frank, the owner, was on the phone, arguing with the supplier. He looked up, saw the figure standing before his counter, and his argument died in his throat. There was an aura of command about the man that was palpable, an invisible weight that settled on the room. "Can I help you?" Frank asked, his tone instinctively deferential. "I'm looking for a man," Thorne said. His voice was quiet, a low baritone, yet it seemed to cut through the ambient noise of the range. "An old man with a Mosin nagant." He didn't wait for Frank's response. His eyes, sharp and analytical, were already scanning the firing line through the plate glass window. He saw the small crowd. He saw the two young men with their high-tech rifles. And then he saw him, sitting on the ground, a pillar of calm in the center of the quiet storm. General Thorne's face, a mask of disciplined control for 40 years, went utterly blank. He pushed through the door and walked onto the firing line, his gaze locked on the old man. General Thorne moved with the unhurried gait of a predator, his eyes fixed on Arthur. The small crowd on the firing line parted for him instinctively, sensing the shift in gravity his presence created. Kyle and Chad, still sputtering about flukes and luck, fell silent as he passed, his icy gaze sweeping over them with dismissive contempt. Thorne stopped 10 feet from Arthur, who was now calmly showing Leo how to clear the chamber. The general's eyes weren't on the rifle. They were locked on the side of the old man's head, searching. As Arthur turned slightly to speak to his grandson, the collar of his worn flannel shirt shifted, revealing the small, pale, star-shaped scar just below his ear. The last piece of the puzzle fell into place. The color drained from Marcus Thorne's face. The disciplined mask crumbled, replaced by an expression of profound, soul-shaking awe. He took a slow step forward, then another. He came to a halt directly in front of Arthur, who now looked up, his pale eyes meeting the general's. For a long moment neither man spoke. The air crackled with unspoken history. Then slowly, with a precision that was both heartbreaking and magnificent, General Marcus Thorne brought his right hand up to his brow in a salute. It was not a casual gesture. It was a salute of absolute, unconditional respect, a gesture of deference from a 4-star general to a forgotten sergeant. His back was rigid, his fingers perfectly aligned, his arm a sharp, clean angle. It was the kind of salute a man reserves for a king or a ghost. "Winter ghost," Thorne said, his voice thick with an emotion he had suppressed for a lifetime. "My God, it's you!" And as he sat there, not a single person in that room knew that the tremor in his hands wasn't from age. It was from the memory of a night so cold it had burned itself into his soul, a night where a shot just like the one he'd witnessed had saved 32 men from a silent death. General Thorne held the salute for a full 5 seconds before slowly lowering his hand. He knelt, the sharp crease in his suit trousers bending as he brought himself to eye level with the seated man. "Sergeant Pendleton," he said, his voice now softer, filled with a reverence that stunned the onlookers. "Arthur Pendleton." He turned his head, his gaze sweeping over the silent, gawking faces. Kyle, Chad, David the accountant, Frank the owner. His eyes were like chips of granite. "Do any of you have any idea who this is?" he asked, his voice low, but carrying to every corner of the range. He didn't wait for an answer. In the winter of 1950, at a place called the Mosin Reservoir, my father's rifle platoon was cut off, surrounded and facing annihilation. They were pinned down by an enemy machine gunner, a particularly effective one, hidden in a rock formation over 1,200 yards away, across a frozen valley, in a blizzard, with winds gusting to 40 miles an hour. He paused, letting the impossibility of the scenario sink in. They couldn't see him. They just knew every time one of their men moved, a shot would ring out, and another Marine would die in the snow. For 6 hours they were being picked apart. He looked back at Arthur, his expression a mixture of awe and remembered terror. Then a single shot echoed from the ridge behind them. One shot, and the machine gun fell silent. The man who took that shot was a 20-year-old sergeant attached to their unit. They called him the Winter Ghost because he moved through the snow like he was born to it, and because he did things with a rifle that no one believed were possible. He made that shot with a standard issue M1903 Springfield using only iron sights. In a blizzard. That shot saved my father. It saved his entire platoon of 31 men. He pointed a trembling finger at Arthur. This man isn't just a veteran. You are standing in the presence of Sergeant Arthur Pendleton, the soul, and at the time anonymous, recipient of the Black Star of Valor for that action. The vindication climax had arrived, silent and overwhelming. The revelation landed with the force of a physical blow. The name, the story, the sheer mythic weight of the truth descended on the firing line and crushed the petty arrogance of the moment into dust. Kyle and Chad looked as if they had been struck by lightning. Their faces, moments before flushed with smug superiority, were now pale, slack-jawed, suave masks of shock and shame. Their multi-$1,000 rifles, gleaming with tactical accessories, suddenly looked like cheap, gaudy toys. The $50 bill on the bench seemed like a profound insult, a piece of trash. David, the accountant, slowly lowered his phone, the significance of what he had captured dawning on him. He wasn't just recording a trick shot, he had documented the rediscovery of a living legend. Frank, the range owner, stood frozen in the doorway of his office, his hand over his mouth. He felt a hot wave of shame for his earlier indifference. He hadn't just failed to intervene, he had failed to recognize greatness standing in plain sight. Leo stared at his grandfather, his mind struggling to connect the quiet, gentle man who taught him how to tie a fishing lure with the Winter Ghost, the legendary hero from General Thorne's story. He saw his grandfather not as old, but as timeless. Through it all, Arthur remained seated on the ground, his expression unchanged. He looked at the 4-star general kneeling before him, a man who commanded armies and saw only the son of a soldier he had once known. He gave a slow, tired nod, the barest hint of a smile touching the corner of his lips. "Marcus," he said, his gravelly voice cutting through the stunned silence. "You got old." The dry, understated wit was the final, perfect confirmation. It shattered the solemnity, replacing it with a wave of pure, unadulterated respect. It was the quiet confidence of a man who had faced down death in a blizzard, and had nothing left to prove to anyone, least of all a boy with a fancy rifle and a loud mouth. Kyle took a stumbling step forward, his face a mess of confusion and dawning horror. "Sir," he began, his voice a choked whisper. "Sir, I didn't know. I'm so sorry. He couldn't finish the sentence. The words were inadequate, empty. What apology could possibly suffice? Arthur looked up at him, and for the first time Kyle saw what was truly in the old man's eyes. It wasn't anger or triumph. It wasn't even disappointment. It was a deep, profound, and weary pity, the look a mountain might give a fleeting cloud. Arthur said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was more eloquent than any rebuke. General Thorne rose to his full height and turned to face Kyle. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His quiet disapproval was more withering than any shout. "You owe this man more than an apology, son," Thorne said, his voice dangerously soft. "You owe him your silence, and you owe him the humility to understand that the tools you carry don't make you a marksman, just as the uniform doesn't make a man a soldier. Character does, and you have witnessed a master class in it today." He dismissed Kyle with a final cutting glance and turned his back on him. The range was now preternaturally quiet. The other shooters, one by one, began to pack their equipment with quiet reverence. They zipped cases, folded up mats, and capped lenses, their movements slow and respectful, as if not to disturb a sacred moment. They were no longer at a shooting range. They were on hallowed ground. She closed the file and set it on the desk. In 48 hours, that file would be open again. But this time, she wouldn't be the one reading it. The video David had taken, combined with the subsequent story that exploded from the small community of shooters, did go viral, but not in the way Kyle had ever intended. It wasn't a clip of an old man failing. It was a testament to quiet excellence. News outlets picked it up, and for a brief time, Sergeant Arthur Pendleton, the Winter Ghost, was a national hero. Once again, he politely declined every interview, turning away reporters with the same quiet dignity with which he had faced down Kyle's taunts. He didn't want parades or recognition. He had a garden to tend to. Back at the Red Stag shooting complex, a permanent change had taken place. Frank, the owner, took down a glossy poster of a sponsored shooter and replaced it with a simple black-framed photograph of Arthur sitting on the ground, holding the Mosin, with General Thorne saluting him. Beneath it, a small brass plaque was engraved with a new range motto: "Respect isn't measured in feet per second." Kyle and Chad were banned for life, a decision Frank announced publicly, but their true punishment was the indelible mark of shame that would follow them in the shooting community. The $50 bill was found on the bench later that day. Arthur had left it there. Leo, however, found an old, heavy silver dollar in his grandfather's coat pocket when they got home, a coin minted in 1950. The bond between the boy and his grandfather was now forged in something far stronger than blood. It was forged in understanding. Leo no longer just loved his grandfather, he revered him. He finally understood the tremor in his hand, the distant look in his eye, and the profound, unshakable peace that came from a life of genuine, unheralded honor. A week later, the fleeting fame had subsided, and Arthur's life returned to its quiet rhythm. On a cool Saturday afternoon, he sat on his back porch, the old Mosin Nagant lying across his lap. The rifle was disassembled, its metal parts laid out in neat, orderly rows on a soft cloth. He was showing Leo how to properly clean and oil the weapon. His hands, steady and sure, moved with a surgeon's precision, wiping away any trace of powder residue, applying a thin, protective layer of oil to the bolt and barrel. The scent of solvent and gun oil mingled with the smell of freshly cut grass. "You take care of your tools, Leo," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble, "and they'll take care of you. But you have to respect them. This isn't a toy. It's a piece of history. It has a story." He picked up the wooden stock, running a soft, oil-soaked rag along its grain, bringing out the deep, rich color of the aged wood. He was not just cleaning a rifle. He was tending to a memory, preserving a piece of his own soul. The lesson that day wasn't about marksmanship or ballistics. It was about legacy, care, and the quiet dignity of a job well done. True strength, Leo was learning, wasn't loud or boastful. It didn't need expensive gear or an audience. It was quiet. It was patient. It was the enduring character of the man and the simple, honest steel that rings true even after a lifetime of silence. If you believe the quiet heroes among us deserve to have their stories told, subscribe and become part of a community that honors true character